This video looks at how you as a historian move from describing the past to explaining the past. And for many of you, this is the greatest hurdle to your success in History GCSE. Historians that describe the past tend to get grades 1 to 3, and historians who can explain the past tend to get the higher grades. So getting over this hurdle is a really important step for all of you. Let's start by looking at what the difference is between describing and explaining. Historians who just describe the past say what was happening, and that what is really important. Historians that explain the past say why things happened. So let's just reflect on that for a second. Describe people, just focus on the what, and explain, focus on the why. Historians that describe the past tend to just tell the story, whereas historians that explain the past use that story to answer the question. Historians who describe the past will definitely still give key details, but historians that explain the past will use those key details. And that, to me, is the really important difference between describing and explaining. I'd like to show what that means by looking at two exemplar paragraphs. We're going to look first at a paragraph that just describes, and second we'll look at a paragraph that explains. These two paragraphs are both answering the same question. The German people were successfully controlled by the Nazi Party. How far do you agree? Here's example 1. Let's read it together. However, there is evidence to say that they were not successfully controlled by the Nazi Party. For example, there were groups who didn't listen to Hitler. The Social Democrats were one of them, as they produced anti-Nazi leaflets to hand out, and probably to persuade people to not listen to the Nazis. They also had the Communists, and these were the most active opposition, as they formed meetings and wrote propaganda in newsletters. There's also another group who opposed the Nazis, young people. They opposed for many reasons, like politics, religion and culture. The Edelweiss Pirates was probably the most effective, as they actually beat up the Hitler Youth, which was a huge risk. If they did get caught, they'd probably die. They also went on camps. They risked everything to try and get people to not like Hitler and the Nazis. This answer's lovely, and it's really good because there's loads of interesting details within it. For example, they use the name of the group, the Social Democrats, and they say what that group did. They name another group from the left, the Communists, and they say what that group did. They name examples of young people who opposed the Nazis and show what they did. But the problem is that this answer just describes the story, and it does describe the story of what opposition groups did really well, with great detail, but they never actually answer the question properly. They never explicitly say why that shows the German people were not successfully controlled. Let's look at a second example, and I think this does this a bit better. I'm going to read this second example out again. On the other hand, the German people were not successfully controlled because there were small groups that did passively and aggressively oppose the Nazis. Left-wing parties like the Social Democrats and the Communists posed opposition to the Nazis because they formed resistance groups, produced anti-Nazi leaflets and propaganda to show how the Nazis should be shut down. These groups were evidence that the Nazis didn't have full control, as they did things that actively opposed the Nazis and showed the public their ideas before being hunted down by the Gestapo. The youth also formed groups like the Swing Kids and the Edelweiss Pirates to passively oppose the Nazis. The Swing Kids were a group of kids that listened to jazz music, which was considered to be black music, which the Nazis were strongly against. They grew their hair out long and they wore baggy trousers to stand out. The Edelweiss Pirates took a more aggressive way to opposing the Nazis. They'd go around beating up the Hitler Youth. These groups were evidence that the Nazis didn't have full control because they sent a message by beating up the Hitler Youth and making leaflets that the Nazis couldn't scare everyone into submission. Now, this paragraph is also really nice, and it's got some good depth in it. For example, these two sections here show some really nice bits of evidence, but the evidence here isn't massively more than the previous example. What this example does do better is it actually explains the question. Now I'm going to show you the two sentences in this that turn this from a describe into an explain. Here's the first one. These groups are evidence that the Nazis didn't have full control, as they did things to actively oppose, and they showed the public their ideas. That sentence there goes back and links up to the question and shows that candidate is using the evidence to answer the question. There's another sentence in here that's also another really good example of an explanation. And it's this last sentence here. These groups are evidence that the Nazis didn't have full control because they sent a message by beating up the Hitler Youth and making leaflets that the Nazis couldn't scare everyone into submission. That last sentence is a brilliant piece of explanation. Partly, they do use that keyword because, but they go on to say why the depth of evidence, why that yellow bit actually does prove the question. That's the key bit. Now, when you're using explanation, there are definitely some connectives or words that can really force you into explaining. And here are some. I think because is a really important word when you're explaining things. But it's not the only thing that you could use. You might want to say, this shows that, this meant that, this is highlighted by, as a result, consequently. These are some words that definitely force you to say why those things happening in the past happened. They're words that force you to explain why those key details you've included answer the question that you're definitely looking at. Now, if we zoom out a little bit, let's look at a suggested paragraph structure of how you might explain. So here's a suggested paragraph structure. Your paragraph has definitely got to open with a signpost sentence, a sentence that really clearly links to the question. That's easy, I think, for most of you here. You've got to then have a first bit of evidence, some key details. Most of you can do that. But in a decent paragraph, after your first bit of evidence, you've got a bit of explanation. An explanation of why that first piece of evidence answers the question. I think excellent paragraphs then have a second bit of evidence. And then finally, a second bit of explanation. And it's this idea of sandwiching the explanation that I think some of you sometimes miss out. Often, some of you open with a signpost sentence, you have one and two bits of evidence, and then your paragraph ends with an incredibly brief bit of explanation right at the end. A decent paragraph actually sandwiches that explanation in, like I've done here. You do that, I'm going to look this happy, and you're going to end up with an absolutely mega grade. Good luck.